So we are going to start with Professor Sylvester Okwunodu Ogbechie. Is a professor of African and African diaspora art at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Is the author of Ben and Wonu, The Making of an African Modernist, and Making History, African Collectors and the Canon of African Art Collection. Ogbechie is the founder and editor of Critical Interventions, a journal of African art, history, and visual culture, consortium professor of the Getty Research Institute, Daimler Fellow of the American Academy in Berlin, a senior fellow of the Smithsonian Institution, and fellow of the Rockefeller Foundation and Institute for International Education. His research focuses on African and African diaspora arts, modern and contemporary art, cultural informatics, and African cultural patrimony. Thank you very much, Sylvester.
Thank you, Gabriel. It gives me great pleasure to be here. My talk today is, let me share my screen so we can begin. All right. My talk is titled Museums, Canons, and the Decolonial Turn. And museums have been considering their colonial histories and trying to shed oppressive cultural legacies rooted in and trying to shed oppressive structural legacies in order to decolonize and diversify their collections and the art historical knowledge they generate. And that's the slide I have here is a screenshot from the Museums Association, basically talking about decolonizing museums. And this is their statement of intent. Decolonization is not simply the relocation of a statue or an object. It's a long-term process that seeks to recognize the integral role of empires in museums from their creation to the present day. Decolonization requires a reappraisal of our institutions and their history and an effort to address colonial structures and approaches to all areas of museum work. So that's great by itself. My research has questioned the modes and forms of knowledge production about Africa, about African art, challenged its canons and historicity, argued about its representation in museums, and evaluated contemporary demands for restitution of African cultural heritage in general. However, the main issue confronting knowledge work in both museum and academia is still the persistence of colonial categories and failure to reflect the voices and diversity of the people whose artworks populate most of these collections. The questions that confront us remain the same. How do we liberate our knowledge work from the stranglehold of colonial and imperial epistemologies? How do we decolonize African art history in order to create new ways of interpreting and displaying African art? I'm investigating these concerns under the rubric of Rethinking African Art History, which I present as a protocol for decolonizing knowledge about Africa's history, contemporaneity, and futurity. So the Fowler model: provenance research and repatriation to African communities. On the specific issue of provenance research, the Fowler Museum of Cultural History of the University of California, Los Angeles, and that's the Fowler Museum image there, is taking an innovative approach to decolonizing museums and knowledge. In 2019, the Fowler began a 3-year research project on a subsection of the museum's African art collection, a gift received in 1965 from the Sir Henry Wellcome Trust. The collection consists of a wide range of over 6,000 African objects collected in the early 20th century. Accompanying this gift was a set of cards related to the objects that contain varying degrees of information on their context of use, technology, and provenance. A 3-year Andrew W. Mellon Foundation grant to expand the above project by engaging in detailed provenance research with a view to repatriating cultural objects to African communities of origin. I serve as a research partner and consultant for this project, working with Erica Jones, curator of African arts at the Fowler Museum, and Carly Forbes, the Mellon Curatorial Fellow researching the African objects in the Wellcome Trust donation. The Fowler project focuses on how best to make provenance research visible so that information generated can be shared between the museum and origin cultures. The detailed research that's been carried out to date accords with the kind of focus suggested by Benedict Savoy and Fairwin Sarr in their report on the restitution of cultural heritage published in 2018. So we've been having a series of meetings, and this is a screenshot from one of our meetings where we were discussing this issue of provenance research and repatriation to African communities. Part of the problems that we were trying to solve with this, of course, was to determine ways in which, the fowler can make contact with these origin communities in order to discuss the process of repatriating some of the works. But the more principal work that this project is doing is this extensive dive into the collection, to create and update provenance information regarding all the artworks, that it's currently looking at. In many instances, as many of you who work in museums know, some of these artworks arrive with very little information attached to them. So the process of determining where what comes from and who is the right person to speak to already becomes a very major issue that the project is trying to solve. Decolonial, and this is from that meeting, a couple of people presented materials. Laura Becker from University of Minnesota Museum, and you can see the timeline that she created here for repatriating cultural objects. Very extensive work that she's doing there. Ndubuisi Zelomba from the New Orleans Museum of Art talked about the difficulty in navigating provenance research in African art using a very particular case of an Anjanu figure at the New Orleans Museum of Art. And what he was trying to do, of course, was to locate the figure in the very specific context of its origin, but also to research not just, the movement of this object, but its diversity within that culture of origin, and track down the appropriate individuals who would usually in the past have been, village elders or shrine priests who would have, had this object in their collection. The other thing, of course, is the material analysis of the objects in question, a lot of which has been going on, and you can see some examples of that here in these images. We've been looking at, using different kinds of technologies to document these objects, to look at, their structures. We found several examples of repairs that had already been done to the objects before they were collected, and all these are very instructive in understanding, the process in which these objects were used. On the right side here, of course, you can see somebody with one of these objects in situ, and this is a very vast project. Again, it's still ongoing. But I want to move away from my involvement with the Fowler Museum's Provenance Research Project to focus on the larger issue of decolonizing museum collections, evaluated in relation to the idea and history of museums themselves. Museums have historically been sites of colonization, expressing the power imbalances between the oppressor and oppressed through collection and exhibition. However, attitudinal shifts in society over the last few decades increasingly compel museums to consider legacies rooted in colonialism through the lens of social justice-oriented and anti-racist programming and exhibitions. And there again, we come to this, decolonizing museums issue, which is part of what we're focusing on today. The recent focus on decolonial knowledge is shaped by the recognition that scholarly approaches and canons change over time in response to changing values, responsibilities, and needs. At the very minimum, therefore, decolonizing a museum necessitates an internal and external analysis of its organizational structure and makeup, including its mission and strategic plan, how the institution reflects the surrounding community, how collections are interpreted, and whose history is being told. In fact, the brief for today's conference, Rethinking Museum Practices, Decolonizing Collections, proposed to discuss and exchange solutions regarding the decolonization of collecting and collection, especially in matters of inclusion, diversity, access, public use, social accountability, and sustainability in cultural heritage institutions. This is a direct quote from the invitation letter I got. These are laudable objectives that, however, take museums and the canon of knowledge they produce as established facts. Thus, while we may seek to re-evaluate its focus, improve diversity of its knowledge production and access, and reframe it through counter-hegemonic or decolonial discourse, it is difficult to see how this work can be divorced from the underlying power structures of museum representation in general. Such pervasive colonial structures are reflected in museums and actually mapped onto the physical terrains of society. Sao Paulo, for example, has museums that present divergent narratives of Brazilian art and culture. The Museum of Art Sao Paulo, MASP, which you see the image right there, aspires to be a universal museum and showcases Brazil's European heritage. This is an interior of MASP, shot showing artworks from the late Gothic and Renaissance, early Renaissance, late Renaissance periods, including, of course, items connected with church altars and freestanding paintings of different religious figures. While at the same time, the Museo Afro Brazil, focuses on its African heritage and displays objects, in relation to the history of blacks in Brazil, which it argues is a fundamental element in any definition of Brazilian life and culture. Now, the fact that Brazil hasn't come up with an inclusive museum narrative that amalgamates its divergent heritage is a reflection of its colonial history and ongoing systemic inequity. So, if we're thinking about decolonizing museums, surely those are places we need to begin from. Western museums now house the largest collections of historical African art, which are central to the production of a canon of African art. The issue of provenance research, of course, arises from this very fact. We are worried about provenance research now because many objects that ended up in Western museums have been acquired without any effort to garner appropriate information about these objects, the nature of the objects, their use, and other relevant kind of data, which we take for granted, for example, in collecting and documenting the kinds of artwork that we see shown in this representative collection of MASP. So, the laudable objectives of decolonizing museums is undermined by its reliance on the canon as a site of discourse, since the canon itself is the problem here in terms of its histories, modes of representation, and the display of African artworks, its exclusions, and how it is implicated in ongoing expressions of coloniality and structural inequality. The impact of the above on how museums produce knowledge about Africa is evident in, for example, this Stanley Museum's website image of a boa mask from Burkina Faso. The African artwork, expertly and subtly lighted, floats in an indeterminate, gradated, and decontextualized space. The caption states that it's from Burkina Faso, made by Nonuma or Winiama people, and purchased for the museum with funds from the Mary Jo and Richard H. Stanley from a Sotheby's auction in Paris on June 11, 2011. Now, you can see part of that in the caption or on the web page itself, and the effort to actually document this fact of where the artwork was purchased, whose funds made it possible, and the dates of its sale reflects this issue we're talking about in terms of provenance. This is how provenance is created for African artworks. The provenance of the artwork before it became the subject of Western speculation is completely disregarded in most instances. Now, the caption that was attached to the artwork notes that the object was collected in 1976 by a private New York collector named Thomas G.B. Willock, who purchased it in Ouagadougou from a local art dealer who in turn acquired it from Uri, a village in central Burkina Faso. A description of the mask provides information about what it was used for and its symbolism. Apparently, the Winiama people in the village of Uri create masks like this one to represent the spirits of nature that watch over them and their families and protect them from accidents, diseases, crop failures, and disasters of all kind. All of these masks were worn by young men of the families that owned the mask. Each mask is owned by an individual senior male elder and is intimately tied to the soul of the man who owns it. This is the caption that accompanies this artwork in the museum display. Now, we can unpack this caption endlessly, but let's consider the following. The mask is a reconfigured artifact rather than a proper example of its cultural model. It is usually positioned atop a vegetable fiber regalia worn by a masquerade who performs along with several others in an ensemble. The entire context of the masquerade's performance, which you can see in the background here in the crowd that's attending to the performance itself, is missing in the website image of the mask. In this, the image traffics in synecdoche by substituting a part for the whole. Now, We know the name of the New York collector who bought this mask, but somehow we don't know the name of the artist who carved it or the name of that original owner, despite the caption's insistence that each mask is owned by an individual male elder who presumably commissioned the original work. One wonders what the effect of removing the mask from its cultural site has on its owners, since the mask supposedly protects them from disasters of all kinds and it is tied to the soul of the man who owns it. To sum up then, this single image shows what's wrong with our discourse. Its representation of Winyama masking traditions is patently wrong because the partial object on display does not represent the actual object or cultural practice it refers to. The artwork is devalued by its description as an object rather than a sculpture. The decontextualized background of the photograph denies any history of the object except that vested in the collector with whom it is identified and with the museum caption that authors its identity and meaning. Through the provenance attributed to Wheelock rather than the artist who carved the mask, the artwork becomes an object of capitalist value that vacates the numinous affects of its original context of use. The coloniality of its current representation and display ties to the colonial context that saw African artworks and cultural artifacts forcibly relocated to the West. If, on the other hand, the owner of the artwork indeed sold the mask to a dealer, then we're dealing with someone that literally sold his soul. What is that soul worth in our discourse, and how do we account for it as an aspect of the artwork's numinous affect? In addition, of course, the Alamy stock photo company that markets images of this artwork online appropriates the intellectual property rights of Winyama artists and culture, usually without compensation to the original owners of the mask. And you can see how these issues compound on a really significant level once you start looking very deeply at that. If you were to be marketing, say Disney movie images in this manner, obviously you would have to answer to Disney's lawyers and the ferocious fight they put up to protect their cultural intellectual property rights to these images is part of the giant amount of money that they actually make. So provenance, as it's constituted in the Western Museum, does away with any allegiance, of course, or responsibility to the African creators of these works, and invests, the authority of provenance in the Western collection and collectors through which the work enters the museums. Now, despite these problems, the object will remain part of the canon represented in the Stanley Museum's collection and remain a subject of discourse despite the enormous and erroneous interpretation of its forms, functions, and numinous affects. We can then ask, what happens to a scholarship in a field founded on these kinds of problematic reconfiguration and assumptions about the history, cultural practices, and racial and ethnic identities of African cultural objects, which is what my own field, African art history, struggles with all the time in its examination of indigenous cultural production. How is it possible for such scholarship to be sustained even when its foundations are shown to be wrong? How is it possible for museums to continue to exhibit these works in this manner when it is very clear and can be shown that that exhibition process they indulge in is extraordinarily wrong and presents a completely wrong and false information about the object in question? Can we reasonably expect such a field to produce new ways of envisioning and interpreting African cultural production? Can such new ways survive the accumulated weight of legitimizing archives and authorities? So I propose that these are some of the main issues that attend to provenance research. If we want to see provenance research not merely as a process of reaffirming the museum's ownership of its cultural items in the collection, but actually contesting the museum's claims to these objects in the first place and contesting its protocols and modes of display and exhibition. Now, the museum as a site of imperial power. Museums have historically been sites of colonization, and many museums have legacies rooted in colonialism. Their collections were from wealthy donors who benefited from empires. For example, Sir Hans Sloane, doctor and collector, funded his enormous collection that will be the foundation of the British Museum with earnings from his wife's slave plantations in Jamaica. And you can see the facade of the British Museum right there. Moreover, his collection profited from the reach of the British Empire, where collectors and travelers all over the world acquired objects from him. the vicious manner in which the British Empire operated can be seen, of course, in its destruction of the Benin Kingdom and complete looting of over 500 years of Benin cultural patrimony in the Benin Punitive Expedition of 1897. Displayed in the museum, these objects have become a very central part of the British Museum's own self-identity, and it's part of the debate on restitution, but it's not really making any serious efforts towards discussing the future and fate of these objects. So, as Ariela Azulay notes in her book on learning imperialism in 2019, she says it's no secret that millions of objects that were never destined for display in museal white walls have been looted from all over the world by different imperial agents. It's no secret that many of them have been carefully handled, preserved, and displayed to this day in Western museums as precious art objects. In these museums, they are continuously produced as disconnected, as if it were the nature of artifacts to exist outside their communities to come into being as museum objects, as if it were the nature of certain people to exist, bereft of the worldly objects among which their inherited knowledge and rights are inscribed. At the same time, it is no secret that millions of people, stripped bare of the material world, including tools, ornaments, and other artifacts, continue to seek a place where they can be at home again and rebuild a habitable world. The imperial logic behind the museum as a site that celebrates African artworks divorced from their African context of origin and meaning is the same imperial logic that denies access to Africans or people of African descent who attempt ingress into the locales of these museums. African migrants trying to get into Europe through the Mediterranean Sea drown in the thousands, while Haitian descendants of enslaved Africans face US border guards that literally treat them as animals. And these are two key images, that basically spells out exactly what I'm talking about here. So we're looking at, the afterlives of imperialism, the afterlives of the process through which many of these objects were collected and relocated to Western museums. Imperialism is above all a process of documentation whose categorizations function by assuming the status of self-evident truths and also creates the precarious category of the undocumented person. Images, maps, and spreadsheets affirm imperialism's ground in material realism, but so too do plundered native items reconfigured in museum spaces as craft or folk art. In this regard, museums encourage the aestheticization and decontextualization of cultural objects, and within its purview, it displays cultural artifacts organized according to a linear narrative that privileges Eurocentric history and aesthetics. The British Museum's display of Benin bronzes, no matter the amount of writing that accompanies this display or the amount of studies of the objects, completely operates without attention to the location of those objects within the matrix of Benin cultural heritage and patrimony. So, as Emma Barker noted, appropriation and transformation of indigenous cultural objects into art is a form of cultural imperialism, and it echoes the cultural imperialism of the modernist doctrine, which renders unimportant the original context of production or modes of display of indigenous artworks. This structure reproduces itself through distinctions between subject and object, between those who have culture and those who belong to a culture. It is this distinction, above all, that decolonial thinking about museums must attend to. And I want to repeat that. It's this distinction, between those who have culture and those who belong to culture that decolonial thinking about museums must attend to. In this regard, the artworks and cultural objects of colonized peoples found in these museums function as documentary interventions in the fabric of time by creating a timeless past in the present as a weapon that generates authorities. Basically, this is a process of controlling time literally and writing histories of loss, death, and violence into these stolen objects, and their representation within the museum ruptures the imperialist frames of reference. The museum as a site of unlearning. The above issues suggest museums reflect the entrenched imperialist power protocols. I therefore propose that our primary work is to use decolonial thinking to challenge the imperial framework of knowledge production through which the museum maintains its position as an arbiter of knowledge about works often looted from other cultures. As opposed to colonialism as political domination, coloniality is defined as epistemic violence that contributes to the production of subjectivities, coloniality of being, and of knowledge, which is the coloniality of knowledge. If we agree with what I said earlier, that the museum, basically colonizes time, we can see how the production of being and knowledge within this process of colonization becomes an ongoing, continuing thing. With formal decolonization, we saw a transition from modern colonialism to global coloniality, a process that has certainly transformed the forms of domination deployed by modernity, but not with the structures of center-periphery relations on a global scale. That's why Africans are dying trying to get to to EU, and Haitians are being subject to this kind of treatment, trying to get into America. So knowledge making since the European Renaissance is a fundamental aspect of coloniality. It is the process of domination and exploitation of the capitalist, patriarchal, and imperial Western metropolis over the rest of the world that denies epistemic diversity and renders non-Western traditions of thought inferior and subalternized. Decolonizing knowledge and power becomes then a task and a process of liberation from assumed principles of knowledge and understanding of how the world is, how it should be, as well as from forms of organizing culture. Decolonial thinking requires that we remain attentive to the subject positions produced in museum displays. If museums are sites where powerful distinctions are made visible and negotiable, they are or can also be a site in which we can unlearn coloniality. The concrete goal for educational work in this discursive position, and that includes the provenance research that I discussed at the very beginning of this paper, the concrete goal for educational work in this discursive position is to critically teach the history of museums and collections, supplemented by other perspectives that address the material and intellectual/epistemic legacy of colonialism in the present. As part of the process of decolonizing knowledge about African art, museums will therefore need to take the issue of restitution seriously by acknowledging the rights of Africans to their own bodies, natural and cultural resources. We have already seen some progress in this regard, but much more is needed beyond just the idea of returning artworks. Germany claims it will repatriate Benin bronzes plundered from Africa in the 19th century. And the return of these artworks is certainly a laudable situation. But what I'm saying here is there needs to be a transfer of ownership of digital rights of this, digital rights to images of these artworks and as well. The future of wealth is in the control of intellectual property rights of specific cultural products and properties. We need a discourse that understands the importance of safeguarding the intellectual property rights of African cultural patrimony so that African countries can manage the ancillary values and benefit from the ancillary values that such artworks produce. So this has to be one of the goals of provenance research, which is to establish firmly in the public discourse the African ownership of these images and all aspects of the image of these artworks and all aspects of the image reproduction in forms known and yet to be invented. I've been exceedingly frustrated by the fact that this second issue, is not going on in the current debates and current protocols, that accompany these restitution cases. Here you see, this tears dance as Benin welcomes back looted treasures from France. This is not the Kingdom of Benin, but the Republic of Benin. Showing the signing of artworks being returned. France solemnly returned on November 9, 2021, to Benin 26 artworks of the royal treasures of Abomi looted in the 19th century by colonial troops. A historic moment of national pride for the Beninese authorities. So the artworks in question, of course, are these royal statues that were formerly displayed at the Musée de Quai Branly in Paris. Decolonial thinking, we may thus conclude that the issue of decolonizing museums is fraught with contradictions and difficulties. There is still a basic assumption that museums' collections are a given fact, and we can only worry about how to present diverse histories and expand diversity in management and attendance. But as we see above, decolonizing knowledge might involve making radical changes to museums as institutions and challenging the very idea of collecting that undergirds them. I do not presume to know more than museum personnel who are actively working to resolve some of the most glaring contradictions and inequities of museum representation, and I will thus leave the specifics of how they engage in the colonial exegesis to them. However, I want to encourage us not to fall into the trap of contesting the canon while retaining its constituent objects, however defined, as a key element in our understanding of African art and in the museum's own self-representation of its own, cultural project or institutional objectives. Museums are a relatively recent invention, and the ongoing pandemic requires us to reconsider assumptions about their capability to endure. I wager personally that museums are not going away anytime soon, but if we continue to use discredited colonial protocols of representation as a framework for our discourse, we will continue to encounter the problems narrated above. The work of decolonizing museums is just gaining momentum and therefore requires that we rethink all aspects of the museum as an institution. Only this approach guarantees sustained change. Thank you very much.